I shall always remember the feeling I had when I saw those invasion ships below. I was first to see them and shouted over the intercom to the other 6 members of my crew. "It's invasion! It's D-Day! At last, hurrah!" We shouted at each other over the intercom. After all the day and night flying we had done prior to this, and never knowing when and where D-Day would be, it was a wonderful feeling to know that it was here at last and that we were in on it. There were no enemy aircraft over the target area, and light flak. I was able to drop our 5 tons of bombs over the emplacement area. We watched the slow progress of the ships below us, inching towards the beaches. We saw them for perhaps an hour, until we lost them to sight.
My name is Joseph Willicombe Jr. I was an American correspondent with the International News Service. I landed at Juno Beach with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, and I've got some very remarkable stories. I have one memory I've never been able to erase from my mind. From the sailing at Southampton, practically all through the 21 hours to Normandy, 4 Canadian soldiers on our ship played an incessant game of poker. No time out except for chow. They were the first ashore from our ship, and I watched the 4 card players come off our LCT on a Bren gun carrier. They were still fingering the cards. About 5 yards off the ramp and into the beach, the left tread of the carrier struck a landmine. The 4 men were hurled, writhing grotesquely, about 20 feet into the air. They came down to land in sitting positions exactly as they had been seated in the poker game. They were horribly wounded. Their ashen gray faces indicated merciful shock. Much of the clothing had been ripped from their bodies. 2 appeared to be beyond medical aid. The other 2 would be crippled for life. Some of us wept for them, unashamed.
At about 7:30 a.m. on the morning of D-Day, while quietly waiting for the allocation of the bombardment target ashore, the ship's engineering officer came up to the bridge from the engine room. He pointed out a rather fine-looking building on the shoreline and said, "I'll bet there are a bunch of bloody Germans in there having breakfast. Why don't you shake them up a bit?" I obliged the whim of my engineering officer, turned our guns on this building, and brought it down to the ground with about 5 well-aimed broadsides.
At 0600 hours, the sea was extremely rough, while all the large LSIs laid at anchor 10 miles off the French coast, with their small assault craft ready to be launched on the signal to start. At 0630 hours, we were lowered to the sea and started the very rough journey towards land, mixed in with all types of landing craft. The assaulting troops were about 20 minutes late due to the rough sea. Consequently, the second wave were right on their heels. In the water ahead of us lay thousands of underwater obstacles with teller mines and various types of shells which exploded on contact. It was the most impressive sight approaching the beaches as the fight was in full swing. We all wondered why they didn't lower the ramp and let us out, but the answer soon came when the craft hit the mines and blew apart, and we dashed through water up to our shoulders to the seawall.
We experienced very heavy flak on the last few miles across the channel. This obviously came from our own Navy, who had been attacked by German aircraft prior to our arrival. About 50 Dakota aircraft on the resupply mission were flying in formation at 600 feet on a moonlit night when the Navy opened fire. Repeated firing of the colors of the day had no effect on the naval barrage. Our gas tanks were hit, but no fire resulted, and we carried out the mission.
When we were making our run in on the beach, the rudder of our landing craft was damaged by shell fire. We couldn't get in close enough to land until the Navy fixed the rudder. It didn't seem very humorous at the time, but now when I look back on it, we must have looked rather foolish going around in circles with shells dropping all around us and everyone else heading for the beach.
When one LCT skipper lost the forward half of his craft, instead of abandoning ship, he took the stern half back to England and into Portsmouth Harbour under its own power. Another LCT returning to England the night of D-Day, suddenly out of the darkness came a battleship heading for Normandy. There was no time for either to alter course, and the battle wagon went right over the 200-foot LCT, which, with its crew of 12, sank without trace.
A private of the Canadians, whose body I found, evidently went down fighting. One could simply reconstruct the scene. Beside him were 4 dead Germans. He had a bullet graze above his right eye. Evidently stopped to dress it. Before doing so, he must have had a cigarette. There was a packet lying beside him, and he had a cigarette in his mouth. His field dressing was opened between his hands, ready to apply, when an unseen German shot him in the back of the head. Even in death, he had a smile on his face.
General Keller called me over and said he would like me to go up to 7th Brigade headquarters and try to find out what was holding them up, as he had not had any word of brigade progress for the past 2 hours. Taking the road to Benny-sur-Mer, I proceeded south for a couple of miles. There were a few dead soldiers along the roadside and in the fields, most of them marked by a rifle stuck in the ground with its butt up. Some of them were Canadian, others German. I could hear rifle and machine gun fire from several directions, but no signs of life anywhere. As I rode along near Colombière, I saw Brigadier Foster, commander of 7th Brigade, and a few of his officers standing at the doorway of a house along the road. After a few words of greeting, I conveyed the general's message. Brigadier Foster took me by the arm to the side of the house and pointed in 3 directions, explaining that the enemy were to his east and to the west, and that his battalion, the Canadian Scottish, south of us were facing heavy resistance and were in danger of being cut off. The Winnipegs to the west had not been able to make as much progress, and had not yet joined up with the British division to their right. On his eastern flank, 9th Brigade, having run into serious delays on the beaches, had not been able to move as far forward as 7th Brigade, and there was an area 3 or 4 miles wide still in enemy hands. Later I realized that this was the area I had just ridden through.
I was with the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, 6th British Airborne Division. The night before D-Day, we had dinner and left for the airfield just after dusk. We were loaded with our equipment at 9:30 at night and sat down to wait. It didn't bother us. The Army always consists of waiting for something. We took off about midnight and tried to sleep before and during the ride because we knew it would be a long time before we slept again. The feeling of going over was typical of the one we had every time we jumped, wanting to go to the bathroom every 10 minutes, and many, many butterflies. We jumped at about 1:30 a.m. at about 500 feet, and were to land at Varaville, about 2 miles inland, and blow the bridge over the Dives. It was a still night, and the channel appeared very calm from the air. There was no firing as we bailed out, but you could hear small arms fire in the distance. Around 6:30 a.m., someone took a pot shot at me. This large Polish lad who had dug himself into a round pothole in the corner of a hedge jumped up, threw down his gun with arms in the air, and shouted, "Mi Polska, mi Polska." He was our first prisoner. As I was walking back from the farmhouse, I stumbled upon a man in the ditch. He was a man I knew well, Lloyd Adams from Manitoba. Awfully nice chap, part First Nations. Quiet. He had been with the assault group that went in first. There was no one else nearby. Adams had been alone. As I cut off the ID disc from around his neck, I could see the chain of events as the news got back to his wife.
Sometime during the afternoon, I'd say about 4 o'clock, someone mentioned food, and up until that point, no one had thought of it. Also, sometime during the afternoon, I pulled out my razor and I shaved. I never missed a day of shaving during the war. At 6 p.m., we went about 3 miles onto the top of a hill near Benny-sur-Mer overlooking the beaches. On the hill, there were about 90 others with us. Of the 4 original tanks, we were the only ones to get to that second position. And of the 40 original men on that landing craft, all 40 were there. Nobody wounded, nobody lost. Here we dug in, and everyone laughed at the depth of my slit trench. When the Germans started shelling, I soon had plenty of company. Mortar fire was falling behind us, and someone said it was the British mortars firing on the Germans. It wasn't. It was the Germans firing at the British. During that night, it was noisy as the devil. planes, bombs.